that. It also, and pulls means that they're reasonably motivated to work even in the situations where it's unequal. What does differ fairly dramatically is if you look at successful pulls. So, as you would expect from the predictions of kin selection, related pairs are much more likely to pull in than unrelated pairs. What did not mesh at all with our hypothesis, though, is that there's no difference in pulling rates between the three conditions for related pairs or for unrelated pairs. So related pairs pull more than unrelated pairs, but within that there is no difference. If anything, they were slightly less likely to pull on the apple-apple condition, which would imply that really what's motivating them is the reward value itself. But we looked at the data a little more carefully, and we noticed something a little odd. So these data are for unrelated individuals only. And if you looked at the unequal condition, so the apple-grape condition, on about half of the pairs, you could consider the pairs equitable. On average, they pulled in the bar pull about, on average, when they pulled in the bar pull, the dominant got the grape 53% of the time, so right at chance. And the other half of the pairs were what we would consider inequitable pairs. So in those cases, on average, the dominant got the grape about 80% of the time. So the dominant usually got the grape. And the distribution was bimodal. There was an obvious split in the data. So some pairs almost always shared. Some pairs, the dominant almost always got it. And interestingly, some individuals were in both types of pairs. So we tested them with more than one pair, tested them as many pairs as possible. We didn't have a large enough sample size to go through and try and tease apart relationships. But it wasn't just that some individuals were better at cooperating than others. And if you look at their success rate based on whether they're in a, what we call the equitable pairs, or based on whether they're in an inequitable pair, you see that the equitable pairs cooperate much better across all conditions than the inequitable pairs do, actually about 3 times as much. So they're 70% successful, and the inequitable pairs are successful less than 30% of the time. So it doesn't look like it's the reward distribution that makes a difference. It looks like what's really affecting the monkey's behavior is the behavior of their partner. So even in a situation where they're getting a less good reward than their partner half the time in that apple-grape condition, they're perfectly willing to cooperate as long as their partner shares the reward with them. When their partner quits sharing the reward with them, then they quit cooperating. Interestingly, the related data look exactly the same. So they're adjusting how often they cooperate with their partners, even when they are either their mother or their offspring, dependent upon how this kin's behavior is towards them. There are actually a couple of interesting things to note. First is that if the monkeys were really rationally maximizing, that's a term you hear a lot in economics, then a rationally maximizing monkey should always cooperate in the grape in the apple-apple condition. There's no reason not to. The rewards are exactly the same. And and we know that there's no theft, so there's no risk of losing those rewards. And then you should fail to cooperate in the apple-grape condition. But that's not what's happening. It seems like they're reacting towards the behavior of a partner rather than towards the reward condition. And the second thing that's interesting is if you remember from the previous graph, they almost always come up and look at the rewards. So it's not just that they completely lost interest in the task and went away and never paid attention. They were still coming up every single trial and looking, but they weren't nearly as successful with the partners who weren't willing to share with them. So again, even though they seem to be upset by unequal outcomes, it looks like unequal outcomes are okay in the short term as long as over the long term your behavior is fair, which actually probably is very good news for cooperation because again, there are very few situations where there's going to be absolute equity in any one interaction. But what should be important is what it looks like over the long term. So if over the long haul you get about the same, then you should keep cooperating with this person, even if one time they get a much better deal than you do. The other interesting thing, take-home point of course, is that if you're with a partner who is not fair in this unequal condition, using the term fair colloquially, then you're not willing to cooperate with them even when you can't be affected negatively. Which also I think has an interesting take-home message for cooperation, which is that if you're in a partnership where you don't expect to be treated fairly, even if you know that you're going to get the same, you're still much less likely to cooperate. And I think that's actually an even more important take-home message. So it's critical if you want cooperation to be maintained over the long term to make sure that behavior is fair all the time and not just assume that some quick change of the incentive structure is going to change individuals' behavior. The last thing I wanted to talk about is inequity in prosocial behavior. We heard a little bit about what some people would consider prosocial behavior from Dan. I want to emphasize that when I'm talking about prosocial behavior in this case, what I'm talking about is an outcome that is prosocial in the sense of benefiting the partner. So I'm not talking at all about underlying mechanisms. There has been lots of work on prosocial behavior in primates, which I'll summarize in a minute, but none of it addresses the mechanism underlying it. All of it is just talking about whether or not there are outcomes that benefit another individual. So there's been sort of a cottage industry on prosocial behavior in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's fairly difficult to interpret right now. So we know that Capuchin monkeys do bring food rewards to each other. That's been documented in 2 different studies done in 2 different labs. So this was a situation where there were 2 monkeys and they had a choice between one option which brought both them and a partner rewards and one option which brought just themselves a reward. And the idea is to compare how often they choose the prosocial option, the option that brings them and their partner rewards, in the situation where they've got a partner as opposed to the situation where they're by themselves. So presumably you should only bring your partner, or you should bring the second food reward in more often if there's actually someone there to get it. If you're just bringing it in all the time because you like pulling the option that has 2 food rewards, that's not being prosocial, that's just liking the option with 2 food rewards. Chimpanzees seem to prefer options that are prosocial. They also seem to be willing to help each other out in some situations in doing basic tasks or in freeing each other. Chimpanzees do not bring food rewards to each other. So this has been replicated now in 3 different studies from 3 different labs using 3 different groups of chimps. And in that same sort of choice situation where you can bring in food for your partner and yourself versus just food for yourself, in several different variations on that, no chimpanzees have ever been shown to be prosocial, even though they clearly understand how the task works and it's basically the same as the Capuchin task. However, what makes this a little more confusing is that in helping situations, chimpanzees do seem to help humans and each other. So if it's a situation where they can release a door so that another chimp can get in and get food, they're more likely to do that. They will actually do so. And they're more likely to do that when the chimp wants in to get the food than in a situation when there's no other chimp there. This has led to some hypotheses that that means that chimps are only prosocial in non-food situations because they see food as a zero-sum game. I actually have some recent data that just came out that's not even published yet, that's come out of a study looking at chimpanzees in a very similar situation to the inequity experiment. And what you find, what we just found was that this group of chimpanzees were much more likely to refuse a grape if their partner got a cucumber than if their partner also got a grape. So they were likely to do the same sort of refusal thing if their partner got a lower value reward than them, which functionally looks like a prosocial outcome. However, bear in mind that the chimps are sitting next to each other, so the probably more likely mechanism is that the chimps were afraid that if they got a better reward than their partner, they'd get beaten up later on, because chimps are fairly aggressive in that way. So I actually don't think it's a food thing. I think that food's not what's causing the difference here. But we don't see very many prosocial outcomes in chimps, and I don't think we know yet why chimps and capuchins are so different from each other. And just adding to the fun, there have been 2 studies done in callitrichids, marmosets and tamarins, and one of them found that these guys were prosocial and one of them found that they weren't. So we don't really know very much about this yet. But what we were interested in was, particularly with Capuchin monkeys, who do seem to be prosocial, how do prosocial motives interact with inequity? So it's all well and good to bring your partner a reward if your partner's getting exactly the same thing as you are. But what happens if you vary it so that your partner's getting something better? So we went back to the bar pull task. And this time we did separate the monkeys because we wanted to make sure nobody could steal anybody else's food rewards, and we also wanted to control who had access to which bar. So it was really important to know who was going to be able to get the food. And this time there was no second bar, so this was not a cooperative study. We were just using the bar pull as a delivery mechanism. And there were 2 food trays again, and we had 2 grapes, a cucumber here for the guy who's pulling and a grape for the one who wasn't, nothing here for the guy who's pulling and a cucumber for the one who wasn't, and nothing here and a grape. So you had a condition of equity where they both got the grape or they both got a cucumber. You had 2 conditions of what we would consider low inequity, so one where this guy gets none and one where he gets a cucumber, and one where this guy gets a cucumber and one where he gets a grape, and one condition of very, very high inequity where this guy gets nothing and this one gets a grape. So the idea is to see if they continue to be prosocial in these situations where they're getting different reward levels than their partner. And what we find is that there's no difference in pulling when they both get the grape. That's self-evident. Why would you not pull for a grape? And there's actually very little difference in pulling when the one who's pulling gets nothing, which also you would anticipate. Why would you pull if you're getting nothing? You do actually see prosocial behavior in that they're more likely to pull for their partner than they are in control, where again there's no partner present, when they've got a cucumber and their partner's got a grape, which is really interesting. It shows that they are willing to be prosocial even in a situation where their partner's getting something better. I should point out that in this task and in all of the other ones I've discussed on the last page, being prosocial means about a 10% change in preference. So this is not a huge change. It's not like suddenly they're going from never pulling to pulling 100% of the time, but they are showing an increase in frequency. And it's also interesting if you look in comparison, you can compare the difference between the partner and the control conditions, or partner and the control setups for each condition. And if the bar is below this midline, it means that they've got an aversion to inequality, and if it's above the midline, it means they're prosocial. And again, it just shows that they're prosocial in most of these situations, but they are antisocial, or particularly not prosocial in the situation where they've got nothing and their partner gets a grape. So it looks like, again, they're perfectly willing to be prosocial, even in a situation where there's inequity, and even in an inequitable situation where they get nothing at all. But they become much less prosocial when their partner's getting something that's much better than they are. So just to summarize, I think there are 5 basic things to keep in mind when thinking about what's necessary for cooperation to work. So first, individuals have to understand the task. Again, this seems self-evident, but given that most of these experiments are done in laboratory situations where we come up with something that on paper looks really great and put it in front of the subjects, it's important to make sure that they actually understand how it works in a non-cooperative situation or a non-prosocial situation to verify that it does work in a cooperative or prosocial. And here I want to emphasize that I am not trying to tangentially get at any particular study. Most studies do a very good job of this. But it's something that's important to keep in mind, and may even be more important to keep in mind for things like policy, where we don't actually bother to test. We just sort of decide that this is probably the best way to do it. It's also important that individuals be able to coordinate. So if, for instance, in Capuchin monkeys, if you block their view, then cooperation drops off by at least half. So it's important to make sure that the situation is set up in a way that functionally coordination is easy, because if individuals can't coordinate, then they're not very likely to successfully gain the rewards. Also, it doesn't work nearly as well if rewards are monopolizable. This is pretty self-evident as well, but if the dominant can get all of the rewards, then subordinates lose any interest at all in cooperating. Why should they? Joint efforts do seem to require joint payoffs, so if individuals work together, they seem to both expect to get some rewards. But it's also important to note, and this is good, I think, that it doesn't mean that they have to be equal or equitable on every individual task, that even Capuchin monkeys seem to be able to look over the long term. I don't think they're calculating necessarily, but I think that what happens is that this may be back to the inequity thing. Eventually, if you realize that, hey, I'm getting frustrated because I never get the good reward, then you quit cooperating with that individual, go find a partner, and maybe things will be better with them. And finally, prosocial behavior does interact with inequity, but it looks like that there's some level of variation, and when inequity gets too high, then there are no prosocial outcomes. Again, emphasizing that we're talking here about outcomes and not about the underlying mechanisms. We don't know what those are. So I'd like to thank all of the people who have worked on these projects. As you probably noticed, it takes a lot of effort to get a little bit of data with primates, so I have lots of great grad students and undergrads who've done a lot of work on this. Thank you very much. And here comes the microphone.
You did cucumbers versus grapes. Just curious, which are qualitatively different. Do you ever do 2 grapes versus 1 grape?
That's a really interesting question. So when we set out to do it, there was still a fair amount we started with Capuchin monkeys, and there was still a fair amount of debate about whether or not they could understand numbers. Personally, I think there's plenty of evidence that they can. Chimps seem to be able to discriminate between things like 4 and 5. So there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to discriminate between 1 and 2. But there was question of whether or not they could. So we decided to go with qualitatively rather than quantitatively different rewards. One of the things that I didn't tell you was how we picked them. We actually chose 20 food rewards and went through an entire series of dichotomous food preferences. And the qualifications were the low-value reward, they had to be willing to eat at least 10 consecutive times in a separate session when there were no foods present. Because obviously if they're refusing it all the time, then that doesn't tell you anything. And then every individual who was tested had to prefer the other one at least 80% of the time. And actually, with both the Capuchins and the chimps, it was functionally 100% of the time on 2 consecutive tests on 2 different days. So we know that they really preferred the grapes to the cucumbers. One of the benefits of doing quantitative is that you can start looking at variation a little more easily, and that's one of the things we'd like to do next.
That was really interesting, Sarah. There's a classic in conflict literature and political science called Why Men Rebel. And the short answer is they rebel because of relative deprivation rather than absolute deprivation. It seems to me that the Capuchins rebel sort of similarly with that inequity result.
Yes, I would say, I think the problem is not absolute deprivation. I really think it is relative, which also has some interesting implications. It doesn't matter how much you're making if there's someone else, sort of the keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon. We haven't looked at that explicitly, but my intuitive assumption from all the work that I've done with them is that they're much more interested in relative distance than they are in absolute. So they're perfectly happy with something small until they see someone else get something better. My guess is we could make them unhappy with grapes too by offering something even better like dried figs or candied ginger.
The title of his book was Why Men Rebel. And I don't know about women, but I can't remember what you said about gender differences in the monkeys. Was that
That's a really interesting question. In the Capuchins, we haven't found any gender differences. In the chimps, actually, we see a lot of variability in the responses, which is undoubtedly related to things like their social group and their husbandry practices and everything else. I've got the new data that I mentioned that I just got with the chimps that isn't published yet. We replicated the inequity study with 16 adult chimps living in social groups at a facility in Texas at MD Anderson. And we were interested in the underlying mechanisms, but what we ended up finding to our surprise was a really strong sex difference. So 10 of 10 male chimpanzees responded much more strongly to inequity than they did to the equity condition. And they did not respond to that individual contrast control condition where they were shown grape and then exchanged for cucumber. And 6 of 6 females responded very strongly to that individual contrast condition and didn't respond at all to the inequity condition. So it was we don't usually see differences that dramatic. It actually sort of fits with what we know about chimpanzee social behavior. So chimpanzees in the wild range in fission-fusion societies, but typically the females spend the vast majority of their time foraging individually with maybe another female and with their offspring. And the explanation that has always been given is that the energetic requirements for a pregnant or lactating female are extremely high. So given the ecology, they need to forage on their own to get enough food. Males, on the other hand, almost always range with other males, and they typically lead in coalitions and alliances, and they have these very long-term coalitions. So it may actually make sense that for these males, what's really important is what your standing is like relative to the other males in the group, because whether or not you become the dominant is probably going to be affected, again, by your relative strength. It doesn't matter absolutely. Whereas if you're a female, all you care about, potentially, is getting enough food to keep your offspring alive. So there may be something to that.
Given that situation, how do you think there's why do you think people in human societies cooperate when there are such pronounced inequalities?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I should emphasize that I'm purely speculating right now. But one thing that has occurred to me is that it may depend on people's frame of reference when they're cooperating. So it may be that people are perfectly willing to cooperate when their frame of reference is their community. So you might be willing to cooperate when it's the people who are at your Y, or the people who go to your church, or the people who are at your school, even though on the larger scale you may not be happy. So for instance, you may find that people who are not happy with the current way that the country is going don't want to cooperate with something they see as a national an item on the national agenda, particularly if it is something that is promoted by someone they don't agree with. Whereas the same person can turn around and be highly cooperative within their neighborhood group or within their political organization. So I suspect that a lot of it is, I suspect what's critical is not only your relative standing within the group or your relative outcomes, but also what your current frame of reference is. And for all of these studies, of course, we've defined their frame of reference by pulling them out of the social group. So that may explain part of the difference.
I also had a question about that graph that you had of the series of trials. I think there were 21 trials, something like that. In all three instances, there was a decline in cooperation over time, whereas I would have expected cooperation to increase in order to increase benefits as learning increased. So why do you think there was that decline in cooperation over time?
Yeah, it's hard to say. And a lot of, that one was not one of the studies that I had done, but it uses the same, so I don't know as well, I didn't run it, but it used the same Capuchins and the same apparatus that I do. What we do see very routinely is decline over the course of a session, and that's easy to explain. They get full. So, I mean, Capuchins are small. You give them enough grapes and they get full. I haven't seen as much decline over the course of sessions. So it's possible that there was something else going on. It's possible that maybe there were some instances where they didn't get what they expected to get. I really can't explain. I can explain it in the dispersed in the clumped condition. I can't explain it in the standard where there was a small decrement. But generally speaking, we see very stable cooperation between sessions as long as it's a mutualistic task where everybody's getting the same sorts of food rewards.
We have time for one more question. I have one. Just a quick clarification about, in the one study you found, there were just some pairings that were inequitable. But you said you rotated the individuals through many pairings. So was it an individual effect so that there was one individual when paired with others contaminated the pairing, or was it a pair level effect that you couldn't predict?
Starting by pointing out that we didn't have a large enough sample size for any sort of statistics on all this. It looks like it's a relationship thing and not an individual thing. So I'm sure you could have one individual who's just always negative, and in that case it would contaminate. But I think it's based on relationships. One of the things that we're trying to do right now is replicate some of these sorts of studies by taking a group and pairing everybody with everybody else. And if you do that with enough groups, eventually you get enough data to try and get at these relationships. But that's my guess. I think tolerant relationships are much more likely to cooperate. We know that from some other studies done by Alicia Mellis and people in her group. So that's my guess is what's going on.
I'm just curious, is there any evidence that chimps or capuchins can feel empathy? If so, there might be some interesting research collaboration here at the UNJ.
That's a really, really contentious question right now. It depends primarily on how you define empathy and what you're willing to count as empathy. There are lots and lots of anecdotal examples that look like empathy, and some of them are fairly difficult to explain by other mechanisms. But the problem is, again, they're things that have been very, very hard to replicate, and in a lot of these studies where you would expect that a little bit of empathy would go a long way in changing their behavior, we aren't seeing their behavior change. So I don't think we have a good answer to that question yet, and what it's going to, and actually we have talked about this, what it's going to entail is some good studies where people pick a mechanism and try and test that particular mechanism rather than looking at these outcomes that may or may not indicate empathy. Because of course these particular outcomes may indicate empathy, but even if they had been prosocial, I should say, could have indicated empathy, but they could have also indicated that there was some long-term reciprocal relationship in the group and there was no way to tease that apart.
I point out that there are instances of empathy in other species, like dolphins, and helping humans. No? You don't think so?
I don't think so. I mean, it's not clear. I don't think we do.
Yeah, in my opinion, the jury's still out. I'm certainly open to the possibility. I think it's very likely that we will see some, but we don't have any good experimental evidence that makes me say absolutely.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to adjourn for a short break.